I always felt uneasy about the basement in my childhood home. It wasn't just the dim light or the damp, stale air. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. My parents dismissed my fears as childish imagination, but I knew better. There was something down there, something unseen yet always lurking. It wasn't just a feeling, it was an awareness, a presence that sent a chill through me whenever I passed the basement door. I never dared to glance down the stairs, terrified that if I did, I might see something peering up at me from the suffocating darkness below. It started when I was about 10. My parents often sent me down to retrieve things, canned goods, dusty photo albums, old holiday decorations. Each time, I felt an unseen gaze boring into me, a pressure that made my breath hitch. The air was thick, pressing against my chest like an unseen force, making it harder to breathe. But the worst part was the farthest corner, where an old wooden door stood, locked and untouched. My father insisted it was just an empty coal storage room from when the house was first built, but I knew better. At night, I could hear the sounds, scraping, slow and deliberate, like something with sharp nails dragging against the wood, trying to get out. One night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore, a deep, guttural scratching coming from below. My room was right above the basement, and the noise vibrated through the wooden floor, sending chills through my body. I pulled the covers over my head, my body frozen in terror, unable to move, unable to breathe. It continued for hours, stopping just before dawn, the silence somehow more terrifying than the noise itself. When I told my parents, they brushed it off as mice, but mice didn't whisper. I started avoiding the basement entirely, refusing to go down even when my parents insisted. But one evening, my mother asked me to grab a flashlight. I hesitated, every part of me screaming not to go, but refusing wasn't an option. I crept down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. The single hanging bulb flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own. I hurried to the shelf where the flashlights were kept, my fingers fumbling in my rush to grab one, when something made me stop. The locked door, it was open. My breath caught in my throat. I knew for a fact that my father never unlocked it. He didn't even keep the key downstairs. The door gaped open, revealing a darkness deeper than the rest of the basement, an abyss that seemed to pulse and breathe. A putrid smell rolled out, thick and wet, like something rotting, something ancient and foul. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the basement itself was holding me in place. Then, from the darkness, I heard it, a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a slow, rasping breath, forming words that chilled my bones, words that made my blood run cold. Come closer. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. I slammed the basement door behind me and locked it, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch. I told my parents what happened, desperate for them to believe me, but they didn't. My father went down to check, came back up, and said the door was shut like always, looking at me with a mixture of frustration and concern. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever was down there was waiting. That night, I lay awake, my body rigid with fear, my ears straining for any sound beyond the rhythmic ticking of my bedside clock. Then, just as I began to convince myself that I had imagined it all, I heard my door creak open. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if whatever was on the other side wanted me to hear it, wanted me to know it was there. At first, I thought it was my mom or dad checking on me, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the silhouette, tall, unnaturally thin, standing just inside my room, its outline barely distinguishable from the shadows that pooled in the corners. My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but I was frozen, trapped beneath my blankets like a helpless child. The realization hit me like ice water pouring down my spine. The basement door hadn't been shut. It had never been shut. I don't remember screaming, but my parents came running. The room was suddenly flooded with light, and whatever had been there, if it had ever truly been there, was gone. My father was furious, blaming me for scaring them in the middle of the night, but I could see the fear in my mother's eyes. She believed me. She wouldn't say it out loud, wouldn't acknowledge it beyond the tightness in her voice, but I knew. The next day, my father nailed the basement door shut. He still refused to acknowledge anything was wrong, dismissing it as just another episode of my overactive imagination. But I noticed something. None of us ever spoke about the basement again. It became an unspoken rule in our home, a subject too dangerous to bring up. Eventually, we moved. I was relieved, eager to leave that house and all its terrible memories behind. But sometimes, I dream of that door, of the voice, of the thing that stood in my room, and every time, I wake with the suffocating certainty that it never stayed behind. It followed me. Years passed, and I built a life of my own, settling into an apartment far from the house I once feared. I buried the memories of the basement, convincing myself it had all been childhood paranoia. Just tricks of the mind, nothing real. But some things refused to stay forgotten. One evening, while sorting through old family photos, I found a picture of our former home. Nostalgia twisted into unease as I traced my fingers over the familiar shape of the house I had spent years trying to forget. Then, my stomach clenched. In the photograph, taken in broad daylight, the basement window was nothing but a black void, not shadowed, not dim, just a gaping absence, as if the glass had been stripped away, leaving only a hole into nothingness. That night, I had my first nightmare in years. I was back in my childhood home, standing before the basement door. The nails my father had hammered in were gone, and the door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the thick, unnatural darkness beyond. A rancid smell seeped out, thick and cloying, and the same whispering voice slithered through the cracks, curling around me like invisible tendrils, wrapping around my limbs, my throat, my mind. Come closer. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight with panic, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But as my heart slowed, I noticed something was wrong. The air in my apartment felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally long, creeping toward my bed, twisting and writhing like living things. Then, a sound. A single deliberate scratch against my bedroom door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I tried to rationalize what happened, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, a lingering remnant of my nightmare. But deep down, I knew better. The thing from the basement had found me again. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances grew, shadows moving in my periphery, always just out of sight but never gone, doors creaking open on their own, no matter how many times I locked them. A persistent, inescapable feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes burrowing into my back whenever I turned away. The whispers returned, barely audible but unmistakable, threading themselves into the silence of my home like an insidious parasite. It no longer needed the basement to hide. One night, as I scrolled through my phone, my TV flickered. Static crackled, and for a brief second, the screen showed a dimly lit basement. A wooden door stood slightly open, its edges swallowed by darkness. Two glowing eyes stared out, cold, unblinking. Then, the image vanished. My apartment no longer felt like home. I threw my phone down as panic took over, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Without thinking, I bolted from the couch, grabbed my keys, and ran out of my apartment. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, standing outside my friend's place, gasping for air. My hands trembled as I knocked on the door, and when she let me in, I couldn't even bring myself to explain. How could I? How could I put into words the creeping horror that had followed me for so many years, now invading even the safety of my home? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake on my friend's couch, every creak of the old apartment building sending jolts of fear through my body, my mind playing tricks on me, making shadows seem deeper, darker, more alive. At the first light of dawn, I made the decision to leave. There was no hesitation, no doubt I couldn't stay another night. I packed with frantic urgency, barely pausing to eat or rest, as if speed alone could put enough distance between me and whatever had attached itself to me. Within a week, I was gone, leaving my old apartment behind like a discarded nightmare. But I knew it wasn't truly over. The fear remained, seeping into my skin, settling deep in my bones. No matter how far I ran, I could feel it, watching, waiting, lingering just beyond the edges of the light. It was never about the basement. It never needed walls or locked doors. It was always there. And one day, I know it will step into the light. I never paid much attention to my neighbors. The Jenkins family was quiet, kept to themselves, and that was fine by me. In the years I'd lived next door, our interactions had been minimal. A polite nod while collecting the mail, a quick wave if we passed each other on the sidewalk, the occasional muttered greeting when putting out the trash. They weren't unfriendly, just distant, the kind of neighbors who preferred to keep their lives private. And honestly, I appreciated that. I wasn't the type to make small talk over fences or get invited to backyard barbecues. We lived our separate lives, and that was the unspoken agreement between us. That's why, when I heard an unexpected knock at my door one evening, I was surprised to find Mrs. Jenkins standing there. She looked different than usual. Her face pale, her posture tense, fingers twisting together like she was trying to wring the nerves out of them. There was something almost frantic about the way she held herself, like she had debated knocking at all and now regretted it. "Sorry to bother you," she said after a moment, her voice tight. "But I was wondering if you could help me with something." I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob. Something about the way she glanced back at her house unsettled me. Her eyes darted toward the windows, dark and lifeless against the evening sky, before flicking back to mine. It wasn't just nervousness, it was fear. "What is it?" I asked cautiously. She exhaled shakily, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the basement light. It won't turn on, and my husband is out of town. I hate going down there alone." I wanted to refuse, make an excuse, but I didn't. Instead, I forced a smile, ignoring the unease creeping in. "Sure," I said. "Lead the way." I followed her across the yard. Her house felt colder than mine, even though it was midsummer. The air was thick, heavy with the faint scent of mildew. She led me down a narrow hallway to a wooden door at the far end. It looked old, older than the rest of the house, like it had been there long before the walls around it. She swallowed hard before opening it. A wave of damp air rolled out, thick and stale. "The switch is at the bottom," she murmured, avoiding my gaze. I peered down the stairs. The basement was steeped in darkness, the bottom lost in shadow. I couldn't even see where the steps ended. Something about it made my stomach tighten. Still, I forced a casual nod and started down. The wooden steps creaked beneath me, the sound swallowed by the pressing silence. Each step felt like I was descending into something I wasn't supposed to be part of. My fingers brushed along the rough wall as I reached the bottom, searching blindly for the switch. When I found it, I flipped it. Nothing. I flipped it again. No response. I pulled out my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, revealing rows of old boxes and rusted shelves. The air was damp, the concrete floor cold beneath my feet. Then, in the corner of the room, my light landed on something else. A door. It didn't match the rest of the basement. The wood was old, warped, and splintered. Deep gouges ran down its surface, as if something had clawed at it, trying to escape. A chill spread through me as a slow, deliberate scraping sound came from behind the door. The air thickened, the walls seemed to press in, and my pulse pounded in my ears. Then, a whisper, soft, childlike, but eerily hollow, drifted through the cracks. "Help me." A shadow shifted beneath the door. My body moved before my mind could process, and I bolted up the stairs, heart hammering. Reaching the top, I found the door shut. I hadn't heard it close. My hands fumbled at the knob, twisting, pulling, locked. Panic surged. "Mrs. Jenkins." I banged desperately, but no answer came. Then, behind me, the soft creak of something moving. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to turn. I couldn't, but I did. The basement was silent, but something had changed. The door at the far end, once shut, now stood slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness oozed through the narrow gap, blacker than the shadows around it. And something was there. I thought I had escaped it. I thought the nightmare had been left behind. But the thing from the basement, tall, skeletal, its limbs stretching unnaturally, had whispered. And the voice hadn't come from in front of me. It had come from behind. The lock clicked. The door swung open. I bolted, shoving past Mrs. Jenkins, whose vacant stare sent a chill through me as she murmured, "You shouldn't have opened it." I locked myself inside my home, refusing to sleep, refusing to think. But as the night stretched on and the silence became suffocating, I heard the whisper again, this time coming from my own basement.